Yeah, then welcome to this talk. It's my honor to sort of close this summer school now, but in some sense it is actually useful here. It makes sense because my project that I'm going to introduce you to is quite integrative. So hopefully you'll see a couple of things here and there that you have already seen. And for the second time, then maybe you understand more, or at least have the happy feeling that you learned something this week, right? So that might be quite a good experience. So the topic here is neural process models of intentionality. And neural process models was basically the whole school. So the only new thing here would be intentionality, but that's quite a big thing to unravel. So I'll do that step by step. So first of all, maybe to motivate here, what you've seen through the school are different spectrum of models actually of dynamic field theory. And if you look at it historically, then DFT started really with models that just were there to capture psychophysical data, right? For one famous one here would be the A not B experiment that was modeled just with one dynamic neural field and one memory trace, right? It was a very small architecture if we look at it from nowadays, but it was quite successful and it was clearly enough to model this A not B experiment and actually sort of model an effect there better than previous models. What we've done though quite recently in our Bochum group, at least, John Spencer still does a lot of experiments, but also his models have grown. But what we kind of now look at are these models that try to capture different specific behavioral competences. Right? Some of you in the workshop already tried some of those. So one would be, for example, architecture that does reaching, right? Another one would be an architecture that does visual search, that is something Raul presented yesterday, or an architecture that does this understanding of spatial language, something like Daniel sort of presented yesterday. So these are all sort of different architectures, but they all have always this goal to reach one competence rather autonomously. And now, of course, if you think about this, we have like different architectures, they all can do one thing. Wouldn't it be sort of an idea to also combine them and really build an autonomous agent, so to speak, right? And the question is now, how far can we take this DFT approach to model autonomous behavior? And that is, of course, a very open question. So we needed some place to start. And we here chose intentionality, which is actually a term from philosophy and has not so much to do with intention. So intentionality really means, from a definition, it's the capacity of the nervous system to generate mental states that are about things in the world. So it's basically our pretty sort of conscious experience of thinking of something, of referring to something. And this can be done in a lot of ways that I will explain in the next couple of slides. So the idea is that intentionality makes up most of our conscious life, because most of our conscious life, we are conscious about something or conscious of something. So the idea now, if you want to model this in a neural process way, is always the same. We have to answer three core questions here. So one would be, how may intentional states emerge from neural processes? How can we create them? How can then they be stabilized in time? And under which circumstances can they be destabilized again, right? And if you work with fields all the time, you might notice this is sort of here parallel to having a detection, then having a stabilization, and then also a reverse detection, right? But I mean, if we talk about these as like representing something is still quite dubious. So if we look further, for example, into philosophy, we find definitions of intentionality. And for example, the philosopher John Searle, famously, he boiled it down to a formal definition of an intentional state, which has two components. One would be a content, that's the thing that you are referring to. And the other thing is a psychological mode, so the way in which you refer to the content. For example, if we take here this red flower as our content, there are multiple ways in which you could refer to that flower. And Searle actually boils it down to 6 archetypical modes. And I just listed them here and grouped them in 2 group directions of fit that I will explain after this here. But first, I want to go through these 6 examples. So there would first be an action way in which you can refer to the flower, right? So if the red flower is part of an action. And the very first and foremost would be like in the presence, you could, for example, pick the flower, right? So that would be an intention in action, as Searle calls it. So an action that you're doing right now. You could also have something like an action plan, a prior intention. So you could, for example, plan to pick the red flower later, right? If you walk in the park, and maybe in the evening, not in the afternoon, and then you can pick a red flower. Or you could even have a very general desire that you want to have the flower, but you don't specify really where and when you're going to get it, but you want the red flower. You would also be very happy if someone else brought you a red flower, for example. So these would be the three psychological modes that are sort of on the action side. And then these are also closely to normal intention, right? You have an intention to do something. The other side would be the more of perception side, the way in which you can represent a red flower, but sort of passively, right? So the thing here would be, of course, first and foremost, traditional perception. There's a red flower somewhere and you see it, so you represent it in a way. But you could also represent a red flower that we saw yesterday, right? That would be then a memory. Or you could represent a general thing about red flowers, and this is what we label here as belief. For example, I represent that red flowers always have a green stem. Might not be true, but it's sort of a general property here. So these two directions of fit, I want to explain in more detail why are these named in this way. So the idea Searle thinks about this is that there is always a discrepancy between mind and world. So for example, in a perception, you could say you start with an empty representation. You don't know yet, but there is, of course, the world out there with the flower in it. And we interpret now the process of sort of getting this mental state to arise would be to go from a no representation to a representation. And what happens here is actually that the mind now fits to the world, right? At least in some way, we try to represent the flower. It's probably not 100% the same thing, but try to represent the world as it is. So the mind fits the world. This is why the perception way is labeled mind to world. On the other hand, if you think about world to mind, it's a bit different. You have a representation in your mind first. For example, you want to pick the flower, but the world is not ready yet. The flower is still there and being quite happy and unannoyed. But the process then would be, again, to come to a state where world and mind actually fit each other. So in this case, you have to do some action to really fit the world, in this case, your own arm and the flower, to your mental representation. And this fit between world to mind is what Searle calls the condition of satisfaction. And you have heard this term probably in one of the lectures earlier before. And this world to mind or mind to world direction of fit is exactly where it comes from. And we really want to look at this as a process model. Searle also discusses this on a really logical, pure level, but we really interpret the condition of satisfaction in this kind of process metaphor, where it's a thing that is going to be achieved over time. And here I want to sort of summarize this again because it's quite detrimental for the talk. So what are sort of the differences between this mind to world direction and the world to mind direction of fit? First, mind to world is really the perceptual part of intentionality, and world to mind is the motor part of intentionality. And the mind to world direction of fit, if you have sort of a mind to world state, like a perception of something, then you can always say, okay, the condition of satisfaction of that is happening at the same time, right? I can only have a real perception if it's fitting with the world, right? So before that, you don't recognize the perception at all. It's not detected yet. While on the other hand, quite opposite, the world to mind direction of fit states, they terminate once the COS is fulfilled, right? You try to reach the flower, but once you have reached it, once you have the flower in your hand, the state is not relevant anymore, and you can continue with another action, as you might see later with sequences. Then for the mind to world direction of fit, you always have to be aware, even though you have a fulfilled condition of satisfaction, it could still be an error, right? Because you never know if what you see is really out there in the world, right? There could be hallucinations, or even worse for memory or beliefs. You could have wrong beliefs, or you could have wrong memories, right? So there's always a possibility that your representation is erroneous, actually. While errors are quite different in a way in the world to mind direction of fit, because here you really need to notify or detect by your own that something erroneous happened, right? If you want to execute an action, like you try to pick up a flower, or let's say you want to catch a ball, that's the thing that goes wrong more than picking up flowers, right? So if you want to catch a ball and the ball flies by you, then you cannot wait for your condition of satisfaction to fulfill at some point, because the ball might be already on the floor, right? And in that sense, you need to detect when an action is not possible to be fulfilled anymore. And we call that the condition of dissatisfaction, and sort of the opposite. So this was rather the summary, now on the theoretical perspective. But what we actually want to talk about is neural process models, right? And here's one thing that I wanted to repeat, because you might see it now in a different perspective. And this would be sort of this little structure of condition of satisfaction detection that you might have already seen in Gregor's talk on autonomy, because we use that quite a lot actually since 2010. And this is sort of our little dynamic field architecture that realizes a single intention in action, so a single action. And the way this goes, I'm going to do in a quite explicit way. So let's say this would be our intention to move our hand or arm to a position in 1D, right? So, and when we want to start that intention, we would activate the intention node, and this would then activate a peak here in this field that would represent the desired state. In that sense, here we want to move our hand to the left. And this would then also affect the motor surface, sort of to then really control the arm movement. And then on the other hand, we have a connection here to the sensor surface, here in blue, that tells us that currently our arm is actually on the right-hand side, right? And it gets also input from the desired state here. And this condition of satisfaction field is set up that only if both inputs, the one from the sensor surface and the one here from the desired state field, only if they overlap, you will form a peak. And if we now, let's say, have this desired state, this will affect here our motor surface, then over time, our hand should actually move to the left-hand side, right? And then at some point, a peak here will form that will say, okay, now sensor and desired state match. Therefore, our world and mind match, right? This being the mental representation, this being the world representation. And then we have sort of a condition of satisfaction achieved. So we have done our action, and this condition of satisfaction representation here now will in turn inhibit this attention node. I hope you've seen this before. Otherwise, now in more detail, maybe it makes sense again. What happens then after inhibition is that this node gets inhibited here, deactivated. Therefore, the desired state will vanish. Because this desired state vanishes, of course, also its contribution here vanishes. And therefore, the whole thing actually is now again in the same state as it was before everything started, before the intention was there, with the only thing being changed now, the hand went from the right to the left. And as you can think now that this kind of representation can be used for multiple actions, right? You just have to redefine what the motor surface is and what the sensor surface is, but it's a pretty general thing that they already invented in 2010. So what did I do now, for example, in my PhD project, was we still have these 6 psychological modes by Searle. And the idea was, can we build a model that includes them all? Because if we have a model that includes all psychological modes, we can show that sort of this model, at least on a very simple basis, integrates all the forms of cognition that we want to realize, right? So the idea was, we have here a model that lives in this very artificial cube world, where it can actually pick up color from these long cubes and then apply color on these small cubes here, as it's going to do on this purple cube here. And whenever color is applied to the smaller cubes, they change to a new color according to some hidden rule. And the idea was that with this very simple scenario, we can realize all 6 states, and I'm going to show you how this will happen. And the very important thing here is that everything happens with one autonomous architecture, right? There was no algorithm from the outside, nothing was controlled basically, except the simulator here was a bit artificial, right? So, and the way this was done, I want to show here with this architecture sketch. So you will not be able to understand now the single fields here, but rather I want to show you sort of where in this architecture the different psychological modes get realized. So in the top hand right, we have sort of a desire, right? The highest level will to mind intentional state, right? Desire. So the idea here would be that the robot desires to paint something in a particular color. And this way here, it wants to color something in a cyan way. And what the desire does is actually it will start sort of the action plans that was rather hard-coded. So it will activate an intention to collect the color, and it will activate an intention to then apply a color afterwards. But what it also does is it activates the architecture's belief system. And what this belief system does is it learns these color rules. Basically, which coating color applies to which canvas color results in which different color. It was a bit artificial here. So this rule would mean, okay, some yellowish color applied on a bluish canvas results in actually lighter blue, for example, right? And what here is used once we have this desire here, it's sort of forwarded to this result, and therefore we can activate a matching belief. And the sort of colors code and canvas color are then used for our prior intentions here, so that we can actually locate the right color to collect from, and then later locate the right canvas to apply our color on. So this would be our prior intention here. And the prior intentions make actually use of the action repertoire that the agent has. So the agent lives in this very simple world, and it has only a couple basic actions that it can actually do, right? Even though this is a 3D world, the agent can only go from left to right. That would be this drive intention here. What it can also do, it can do visual search. That's something you, for example, did in the workshop. It can recall somewhere in the world where colors have been, and it can reach for objects that it can see and then pick up and apply color onto these objects. And these kind of intention and action fields here are connected to the agent's sensory motor surface. So this would be then in our simulator here, the wheels and the arm motors, for example. On the other hand, the sensor part of the sensory motor surface is there to have a visual representation, right? So the agent maybe is not able to see in this picture here, but there's actually a small little camera on top of the robot, right? So it can actually see the world and therefore can have a little scene representation. So that's a very simplistic variant of the one that Raul showed yesterday, right? So it can select attentionally objects in the scene and extract their color and their height. And what it's also able, and that will be kind of relevant later, it can also detect if color changes in the scene, right? Because it needs to detect whenever the painting was actually successful. So it can detect when a block of color changes from blue to red or any other color in that sense. So now I want to show you a couple of excerpts from this architecture, and hopefully you will be able to understand a couple things here from that thing. By the way, I didn't say this in the beginning, but please interrupt me at any time, right? I might run through this too fast because I'm very familiar with that architecture, which is not the case for you, right? So please interrupt me if there's something weird here. So first, I want to familiarize you here with these kind of plots that you're going to see. It's a bit odd here that we have sort of a space representation that's only one-dimensional. So what's happening here is this is what the robot sees, right? This very simple world here with two little blocks and one large block. And this will be transformed in a 2D field on retinal space, so from left to right, and color here. So we see here a purple object on the left and two yellow objects here on the right and in the center. And another map that's quite similar that is on retinal space again, and then on height, with only two heights actually being possible. So two small objects here on the left and the center, and one large object here on the right. And the rest is basically just how we got there. So what is now a perception of an object in this kind of scenario? And I want to show you this here for color. So as you might have noticed from the scene representation architecture, in order to really extract the features of a single object, you need to intentionally select it here. And this is what really amounts to a perception in this kind of architecture, is that you have sort of this salience input. So you know there are two objects, but and you have sort of this feature map of where these objects are and which color they have. But only if you intentionally select one of these objects, just like you did in the theta exercise, for example, you are then able to extract the color information from our retinal color map here by sort of giving this rich input here in the spatial dimension. So only if we select here the leftmost object, we are able to retrieve the feature blue. And these two peaks sort of in combination would be together the intentional state of perceiving the blue block. And there would, of course, also be another field that shows you the height of that block. It's also connected to the attentional selection. So here I have a little video how this perception then leads to memory build-up. I hope it's somewhat familiar to one of the videos that Raul showed you yesterday, but I think the video always clarifies the whole thing a bit more. So let me first show you here what these different components are. So this is the scene where the robot is. It's in front of these two longish blocks here, and it has already formed a memory of these three blocks here on the left-hand side. So this is what the whole memory is about. Now the color here is on the bottom, and what is here on the left is an allocentric space. So it's not only the camera space, but it's the whole space that the robot can traverse, right? So you can see this here, that sort of on the left-hand side in this space, there's a yellow object. Then in the middle here is a purple object, and on the right-hand side, there would be a bluish object. So these would be these three things here. So this is sort of our memory representation. And what I want to show you in this video is how these two blocks that are not yet in memory, they should be somewhere here, will be added to the memory. And this happens by the robot selecting one of these two objects. So this is again here the camera space, the egocentric space. So with two objects here, the robot will select one of those. Then it will extract the color from here, the color space map. And what is then done is actually that this egocentric position is transformed into an allocentric position. And this way, we can take sort of the color that we perceive, combine it with the allocentric position, and then add it here into the memory field. So this will happen 2 times, and I hope you can follow through. So I press play here. So first there will be a selection here of the right-hand object. This will lead to a color extraction. And then very fast, maybe I should, can I actually slow this down here? Yeah, I should be able to. Thanks, YouTube. Let's maybe do this at half speed. Might be a bit better. So press play and maybe look here how a peak will arise here in the memory gate and then be forwarded to our memory field. And once this memory is formed, we'll also form a peak here in our memory selection that will then prevent the peak formation in the memory gate. So this will then lead to a second selection. Now the left object that we didn't select before, the object position will again be transformed here in allocentric space. Similarly, the peak will then be added here in our memory. And you can see it's the same color as the neighboring object, here blue and blue. So this is how sort of memory can here be formed on the allocentric level, even though the robot perceives everything only in the egocentric view. And for that, you of course need to do this transformation that I didn't talk about, but maybe it was in Raul's project, and it's actually done by also knowing where the robot is in space, right? So for that, we used a little shortcut there. So that was sort of the perception and memory part. So 2 times the mind to world direction of it. What I want to show you now is an example from the architecture of the other direction of it, the action part. And here I already showed you this example in a lot of detail about moving the hand from the right to the left, right? And of course, in this scenario here, you could also think of this robot being a hand that goes along a path, right? So it's just a movement here. And as you can see from the layout maybe, that this looks pretty much like the thing I showed you before. We have an intention node to drive somewhere, and we have a desired position here. That would be, for example, the right-hand side. And this also then projects here to a condition of satisfaction field. This is actually an error here. This should be below threshold. But this is actually the way the driving is realized, by just reusing the same intention action architecture. The only thing that is new now is we have here an explanation where the desired location actually comes from. And this is, of course, from a different part from the architecture. In that sense here from memory. So what the robot can do, it can remember, oh, there was this small little yellow block somewhere on the right. And if this memory peak then can be forwarded to this drive intention field. And the other thing that is now new would be the whole architecture realizes actually the driving, right? That's actually does here some oscillation that then drives the wheel motors. and we have a real position sensor in our simulation that simulates where our robot actually is. And with that, we can then use that information to really terminate the driving. So this is basically what a full architecture looks like, and I just wanted to add that here sort of as an addendum to the example at the beginning. And the other thing I want to show you now is how we can get from one intention and action to maybe an action plan, an action sequence of multiple actions. So as you might please now remember just that we have a drive intention node and a drive condition of satisfaction node. And in this next picture, you can see this here in the top middle, right? In the bottom middle. And what this is now part of is actually of the full-on action sequence to locate an object somewhere in the scene. And this artificial action sequence has sort of three components. The first component would be to recall where the object is. The second would be then to drive at that location. And the third thing would be then to visually search for that, because even if we record something, right, and you go back there, it might have changed, right? So therefore you still need to do a visual search. And the way this is realized is using these precondition nodes. And I hope you have seen them before, but the idea here is that a condition of satisfaction node of the previous action here inhibits this precondition node, and the precondition node itself inhibits the next intention. So what happens in the beginning, this will be inhibited by the precondition node, so driving will not be executed. But once recall is done and there's a condition of satisfaction active here, it will actually inhibit this precondition node, and sort of through this double inhibition is then gone, and then the drive can go on. And the same thing here is happening after drive. So whenever driving is done, it will sort of inhibit the corresponding precondition node, and then a visual search will be initiated. And this thing can, of course, be organized in hierarchies, as this whole thing here is supposed to show. So the whole idea of location is also the same thing as the bottom ones. It's actually also an intention node and a condition of satisfaction node. It's just different now. It's not directly the sensor motor surface that drives these, but rather other intentions in action here. And of course, on the upper levels, you can also have sort of these sequences. So after you located a specific object in the world, you could, for example, reach for it. And this was just now the names and this dry architecture. But again, I want to show you how this looks now in a video. So again, let me talk you through these components. So the left here, we have this scene now with a couple of more objects visible. And the idea is that the robot has the intention to locate an object that's yellow and that is large, right? So this would be the object here on the right-hand side. And the robot also has already quite a memory of a couple of objects. And in particular, it has knowledge of the object that is yellow and large, which is this object here. Here's the yellow component, here's the large component. So what will happen here is a peak will form here in the locate field, and sort of the desired location and the desired color will form a particular, or will cue the memory, therefore will form a particular selection of a particular location. And this location then, once it has been recalled, the condition of satisfaction recall activates, which will then in turn drive the intention to drive somewhere. And this again then, once the robot successfully drove to the desired location, will activate the intention to visually search. And the condition of satisfaction for visually search is that these features here that we desire, which will be the ones driven by locate here, so yellow and large, have to meet sort of the same location features of the that we currently attend. So and then once this is done, of course, we will start to reach. So let me show this again. First, peaks come up. They drive here the memory selection up. Wait, let me also slow this down to 0.5 speed. Start again. So first peaks will emerge that start the overall location process, yellow and large. This will be forwarded here, which will then lead to a recall of the right location. This leads the robot to drive to the rightmost location. Here you can see is the current position of the robot, and here it will be compared to the real position of the robot, the desired and the real position will be compared here in the condition of satisfaction drive field. So after some amount of time, the position here will be updated. This leads to a condition of satisfaction, and that starts the visual search. So different objects here will now be attended. This was the rightmost one, that was wrong. But then it attends another object. It's the middle one, and here features map here and here. So this activates the condition of satisfaction for visual search, and then the robot can actually start to reach. And this should be able to be seen here in the simulation. So this is sort of how sequences can be realized by having this clear representation of a condition of satisfaction, right? This really helps to detect sort of the moment in time when you can transition from one action to another. And I hope you already saw this on Wednesday, but now you have seen it in another scenario. Pretty much the only thing that is now rather new is sort of the learning part of this model. So the robot, as I said, should learn these combinations from which color plus which other color leads to whatever, the third color. And this is, has to be done sort of through autonomous learning. And that means it has to learn from self-generated experience, right? We cannot use any deep learning. There's no way we can compute an error function. And even reinforcement learning is not really easy, because then somebody would need to give a reinforcement, right? So it has to learn from itself. Therefore, we need to make up something here to give the robot an opportunity to learn. And the idea is here that self-generated experience means the robot has to act on its own and sort of then have experience. So autonomous action is realized, or in some form, autonomous action is realized through the intentions and action of the robot and its prior intention. So these two intentional states of the world to mind the action of it. And the experiences then are, of course, of the mind to world direction of it. So perceptions and memories are the experiences the robot has. The problem is now, if we want to learn from these, we have a couple of neural constraints, right? If this should be neural plausible learning, pretty much the only plausible learning would be local learning. That means the information that you want to learn has to be present at the synapse. So pretty much the only known local learning that is talked about is Hebbian learning. And the other thing is, when you learn neurally, you always have to be careful that you don't overwrite your knowledge, right? Which is called catastrophic forgetting. That can happen with deep neural networks, can also happen in a Hebbian learning scenario. So that whenever you learn something new, that you override or forget your previous knowledge. So we have to make sure that this stays alive, and therefore we have to be robust against the effect of catastrophic forgetting. And of course, whatever we learn, we also need a mechanism to recall whatever we learned. And this is what sort of this architecture for belief learning does. But let me first sum up what it really does. I forgot that I have the slide in between. So the idea is here, it should be able to learn from a single episode. That means the robot should collect color, then apply the color to a certain canvas, observe a result color, and should then be able to associate these three things with one another in one sort of belief representation. And these belief representations should then be used in the following form: that if you desire a certain color, for example, I want to have now a blue result color, you should be able to recall the whole belief, so the association with the code and the canvas color, and then use this to really actually result or paint a blue box just like you desired, right? And then, because there can also be wrong beliefs, maybe because your knowledge is outdated, it should also be possible to notice or to detect when something went wrong. For example, I would go about collecting color from the purple coating dispenser here, the color bucket, for example. I would apply it then to the yellow canvas, and I know it should result in dark blue, but then it results in light blue here. I should be able to detect this and at least do something about it. And this is what this rather big belief architecture here in the end does. So this is, in a form, a realization of this adaptive resonance theory that Gregor mentioned during John's talk. And I will go step by step through some of the connections here, and I hope you might take something away from it. So the very core of this architecture is these belief nodes here on the top, B1, 2, B3, so multiple beliefs until Bn. We could imagine there could be indefinitely an infinitely number of those. And these have sort of possible all-to-all connections to these three different rows of concept nodes. And these would be the code colors, these would be the canvas colors, and these would be the result colors. And the learned belief would then be sort of a belief node that connects to each a concept node of each of these rows here, right? So this would be the belief red on green results in blue, because it has sort of the red coding color connected, the green canvas color, and then the blue result color. A different belief, for example, would be this one here that is connected to the blue coding color, to the cyan canvas color, and then to the red result color. So it would spell out blue on cyan results in red. So this is sort of the core, and a very important factor here is that these connections go in both directions, right? So whenever I activate this node, this belief node here gets a little activation, but also the other way around. When I activate this belief node, it will activate all the corresponding other nodes, and we need this later for belief recall. So how can actually a belief be learned now if the robot engages in its regular painting routine? The thing that happens is that during painting, the robot will actually memorize in the self-sustained field here, sort of the working memory of the robot, which colors it used. So once it picked up a color here for coating, a peak will emerge here in the coating working memory. And this peak then will activate the corresponding concept node. So these concept nodes are actually like a continuous dimension, but just in discrete nodes. So because you want to have maybe multiple shades of blue, and they all should then result in dark blue, for example. So I have here this peak in blue, and this will then automatically activate the blue concept node. What will also happen is that the blue concept node, through this bidirectional coupling here, will also pre-activate this B2 node here. And what then would happen is that after some time, the agent also chose a canvas. They did this so randomly, right? Because it's exploring different colors. It would choose a green canvas. This would activate the green canvas node here, and that would then activate the B1 node because it's connected with that. So we have already two conflicting beliefs here. So we want to make sure that only a belief is activated whenever it matches both or all things, right? The code color and the canvas color has to be right. And this is actually what we prevent here by using sort of a general inhibition, that for each node that is active here in this row, all beliefs will be equally punished through inhibition. And only if all the concept nodes simultaneously excite these beliefs, they will be able to withhold that inhibition. And this idea comes from exactly this adaptive resonance theory, which was done by Carpenter and Grossberg, where they really want to have, they call this, I think, the vigilance parameter. They always want to see if sort of the current input to the network, which would here be code and canvas color, if they are in resonance with the learned representations. And right now, sort of having a blue coating and a green canvas is not in resonance with any of the learned beliefs. So whatever we now see as a result color has to be connected to a new belief node. So let's say we chose this canvas, or the agent rather chose this canvas color. It will, after some time, then observe a result color because the green block here changed then into purple. And this will do two things. It will activate, of course, this result color concept node. And because there's no fitting belief, no belief will be activated. But it also activates our color change detection that I showed you in the architecture sketch, if you remember, like 10 slides ago. And this color change detection actually is responsible for the recruitment of a belief node. And it has to recruit a belief node that is not yet already occupied with a belief, because we don't want to override old beliefs. We have to prevent catastrophic forgetting. And for that, we use this kind of row of commitment nodes here. Each of these commitment nodes might already be activated if there is a belief connected to that already. And these commitment nodes have then an inhibitory influence here on these belief nodes. So what happens with the color change here is that all commitment nodes get activated, and those that already are connected to a belief with content will be inhibited. So that then later these nodes here operate on a different time scale. This one is faster, this one is slower. All other nodes get a boost, and from those only one will be selected, and in that case here that would be B4. So if we have B4 active and then these 3 concept nodes active, we can actually use a Hebbian learning rule, right? So that connects all the nodes that are currently active with one another. And this is done here then because this node here that checks whether any belief node is activated will actually trigger a reward signal. So we have a thing that's called then a reward-based Hebbian learning rule. It connects the active nodes with one another if there's a reward signal present. It's not really an outside reward like in reinforcement learning, but we sort of chose here this color change as a thing that triggers an inside internal reward signal. But you could think of this as if you eat some nice food, that also triggers an internal reward signal for you, right? If you were hungry, hopefully. So this would be the belief architecture and how you could learn a new belief. And of course, you also have to now learn that this belief is connected to content. And for this, you would learn a connection here between the commitment node and the paint node that uses actually the same learning rule and the same reward signal. But now I want to show you how a recall can be done. Oh, and apparently I forgot here the nice slide. So let me stop this. Let me preemptively already put this to 0.5 speed. And what I want to show you in this last video here is how the belief network can then be used to recall a fitting color rule and use this then to paint a color object. So what will happen here is a color from the desired color will activate, or not activate, will cause a peak to form here in the result color field. That peak then will activate a corresponding concept node. So as you can see here, these are the concept nodes as before: yellow, light green, green, cyan, blue, and so on. A concept node will activate then a belief node that is connected to that concept node. And once the belief node is active, through these bidirectional connections, it will activate a fitting code and a fitting canvas node. So let me first do this, and then I'll talk further. So the peak will emerge here in the result color field for yellow. This should then activate the yellow concept node. And this then activates here belief number 1. And once this is active, a concept for blue and for purple will activate. This will lead to these peaks here for blue and purple. And because now these peaks are present, the whole location and reaching thing will activate. So the agent will now first locate the blue object. And I think it recalls its location. First, it starts sort of with an exploration, but then it recalls. So it drives directly here to the blue longish one, then collects the color, and will then drive to the purple small block, which is here, to apply the blue color there. But what will actually happen is that the color will not turn out to be the yellow result color as the agent thinks it should, because it happened so earlier. But the color now will change into the new cyan color because I changed the rule where the agent was not looking. And what will happen then is that the agent will detect this change through this condition of dissatisfaction detector here. So what happens here, it's a transient detector, as you might have seen before. It has input here from yellow because it expects yellow, and this yellow inhibits here any yellow. So if a yellow peak comes up, nothing will happen. If a yellow peak comes up here, but if any different peak comes up here, it will actually emerge here in the condition of dissatisfaction detector, which will then lead the agent to learn a new belief. So it will happen here, hopefully right now. A different color should come up any minute now, second rather. It usually takes some time. I think I use 0.5 regularly. Yeah, now something happens. So a different result color is now observed, not yellow as expected, but cyan. And cyan will result then in activation of the condition of dissatisfaction detector. And this will now change, of course, also the result concept node. And what will happen now is that the agent will incorporate this rule into its set of beliefs, so it could later also activate the CIAN rule. It will not, though, override the old rule, because this part is not part sort of the learning here. That would be sort of another way of, or another level of higher cognition, right, to also exclude now the old rule. But we left this out here of our model. So this was a rather lengthy illustration of this scenario, a bit didactical. I hope that helped. So in the end, what I did show here was sort of a whole integrated model that goes basically from the sensory-motor surface to these abstract representations, such as beliefs. And for all these psychological modes, there's at least one process model there. And it also uses sort of the autonomous learning here. And the only thing that you might learn from this rather specific architecture here that's quite big is that you need a lot of infrastructure for autonomous learning, right? Because you really need to make sure that the right activations are there at the right time. If you have such a big architecture that is not only learning like a single policy, but has to also do a lot of actions here. So are there any questions from you?